Great, thank you for that introduction. It's really great to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm wearing a wireless mic. Just based on past experience, I just will end up coughing under my breath without planning on it, so I apologize in advance. As was just noted, the title of today's talk is Legislative Effectiveness in the Contemporary Congress and the 2018 Midterms. The plan for today is what I'd like to do is introduce you to another aspect of my research that wasn't really commented on in the introduction, and that being focusing on trying to understand legislative effectiveness, and by that I mean individuals' abilities to advance their own agendas in the United States Congress. So I'm going to give an overview of some of the research projects I'm involved in, talk about some of the broader conclusions that follow from that research, and then I'm going to turn it to a discussion of what happened more or less last Tuesday. We're still trying to figure it out at the moment, and then talk about what the implications are likely to be for the 116th Congress moving forward. So having said that, it goes without saying that right now the United States is facing or trying to wrestle with quite a number of substantial policy problems, whether it be concerns about the ongoing education system or education gap in the United States, skyrocketing medical costs, the plague of gun violence throughout the United States, the threats, either implicit or explicit, of cyber attacks in the U.S., and regardless of, the national debt skyrocketing as well, and regardless of where people might fall vis-a-vis debates about climate change, I think it's fair to argue that no one would find that a particularly appealing picture. So in light of us trying to wrestle with these problems, and we've seen this most recently in the election that concluded last week, or is about to conclude in a couple of jurisdictions, there seems to be an ongoing tension in American politics and American society about the extent to which our current institutions can really wrestle with these problems. This was an ongoing focus among campaigns on both right and the left, and there's a pervasive strain or pervasive theme in debates among the American polity that our institutions as built are dysfunctional by design, or at least they become dysfunctional over time. Most of my day job is actually spent studying one of these relatively dysfunctional institutions, and that being the United States Congress. And if you're like many Americans, you probably are not huge fans of the US Congress. Just as a point of illustration, this figure here identifies a time series going back to roughly 2009-ish up until current day. These are public opinion polls that were aggregated as of pretty much September-ish of this past year. And as you can see, the approval, that's the black line down here, for the US Congress really hasn't passed its high water mark of about 20%, which is today. I've been giving variants of this talk for the last several years. When I first started doing it, Congress was right around 8%, so I guess on the bright side, we're above 20 now. But it goes without saying that most people are pretty unsatisfied with the ability of Congress as an institution to advance legislative agendas to engage with some of these policy problems. And of course, the question becomes, how can we go about trying to solve these policy problems in the context of the current institutions the United States is dealing with? This having been an election year, we know, obviously, according to either the parties, what the solution should be. Democrats would say just elect more Democrats and the problems will be solved. Republicans would say elect more Republicans and the problems will be solved. But of course, in light of today's polarized parties, we might want to ask ourselves whether or not electing larger blocks of either party is necessarily going to solve or enable partisan actors, legislative actors, to engage with any of these problems in a meaningful way. And much of the political rhetoric that's espoused by both sides, as well as truthfully the way in which politics is covered by mainstream media in the United States, is focused largely on identifying the ideological divisions or distinctions between the parties, and very often pointing to the ways in which, in light of this ongoing gap between the parties, it might be very, very difficult for members of the legislature from either or both sides to come together to advance policy solutions. So having said that, myself and my co-author, who's named Craig Volden, he's currently the Associate Dean of Faculty at the Baden School of Public Policy and Leadership at the University of Virginia, we've been engaged in an ongoing research project for almost 10 years now, in which we've been trying to basically look at what's going on in the United States Congress, not through the lens of thinking about who's left or who's right, who's more or less ideological, but instead we've been asking ourselves, if we think about essentially every profession in the world, whether it be teachers, whether it be athletes, whether it be accountants, attorneys, name whatever you'd like, it's fair to argue that some people, by their very nature, are generally better at the profession than others. They have natural skills, or alternatively, they could cultivate these skills to advance themselves in their profession. And it serves to reason that being a legislator should be similar in this regard. Some individuals might just generally be more effective lawmakers than others. And if we ask ourselves to just essentially blow up the left-right distinction and ask ourselves among both the scholarly community as well as members of the American polity, is there a way to identify who is more or less effective at advancing their legislative agendas? What we would argue is the answer to that question is yes. And to illustrate that, we have a book that was published back in 2014 titled Legislative Effectiveness in the United States Congress, in which we did just that. So the book essentially focused on analyzing legislative effectiveness in the United States House of Representatives from 1973 to 2008, in which we essentially drew data on every single bill that had been introduced into the U.S. House across this 35-ish year period. So it's roughly about 135,000 bills, and identified the progression of each bill by each sponsor to identify in a summary statistical way which members of the U.S. House of Representatives were unambiguously more successful or more effective at advancing their agendas than others. So to provide you with a broad overview of what we were doing, essentially what we did is for every member in the U.S. House, back then 1973 to 2008, but we've updated the data to include both the current houses as well as the U.S. Senate, we identified how many bills an individual introduced across a 2-year period of Congress, or 2-year session of Congress. How many of those bills received any sort of action in committee? And by that I mean committee markup, committee hearing, they're able to get some attention for their legislative matters. How many of those bills received any sort of action beyond committee, meaning they actually advanced to the floor, they might have been the focus of floor debate, perhaps a floor vote. How many of them ultimately passed the House? And finally, ultimately, how many of them were perhaps signed into law? Now, it goes without saying that not all bills are equal in terms of importance or perhaps difficulty of advancing them through the chamber. We would expect advancing major financial services reform, for example, would be a little bit more difficult to advance than, say, renaming of a post office. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. So to account for this, what we did is we upgraded certain bills based, we upgraded certain bills based on whether or not they were denoted as being substantive and significant. And other bills that clearly, other bills that clearly focused on commemorative matters, we downgrade them as being commemorative. And then what we did is we essentially rolled all of this data into a legislative effectiveness score for every member of Congress. So to dive a little bit into the weeds, but just to give you a sense of what this entailed, the following is an illustration of a bill, that being House Bill 5995 from the 114th Congress. I know this is quite small back there. I'm just going to read off a couple of highlights. This was introduced into the U.S. House by Representative Mark Meadows. He's a Republican from North Carolina's 1st District. It was introduced into the House on September 12, 2016. Some of you are interested in legislative politics or trying to identify the ways in which certain bills are or are not going forward. A great resource is that of congress.gov, which is the Library of Congress's website, which identifies, catalogs, and categorizes all legislative data that's ongoing in the U.S. House and Senate, pretty much from 1973 up until current day in real time. And all of the data that we use for our project is drawn directly from the Library of Congress's website. So essentially, this is an illustration of a bill. You could see this ultimately was introduced, passed the House, passed the Senate, to the President, became law. And even more so, if you were to hypothetically click on all actions, that's what you'd see, which is even smaller than the previous slide, but just to illustrate there's lots of stuff here, okay? And what this is this illustrates essentially every step in the process that the bill went through, from the day it was introduced on September 12th, through hearing markup, through ultimately passing the House, to being received in the Senate, passing the Senate, being presented to the President, and finally being signed by the President on December 14th, 2016, when it became public law. So what we essentially did then, as I said, is we, and by we I mean some really bright young undergrads who are very good with writing computer code, one of which we're pretty confident is now working for the NSA. Essentially, they wrote up computer code to basically strip all the data from the Library of Congress's website for every single bill that was introduced into the House and into the Senate. And then for every sponsor, we identified how many bills they introduced and each of those 5 status steps that I described. And from that, then, we're able to generate, as I said before, a legislative effectiveness score, which is a summary statistic. It's normalized to be an average value of 1. So the average, or the person who has the average degree of effectiveness in any given Congress has a score of 1. Anyone above 1, that means they're more effective than the average member. Anyone below 1, that means they're less effective than the average member. And that 1 score tells us, across any 2-year period of Congress, who is more or less successful at advancing their legislative agenda items from start to finish in the process, adjusting those agenda items for substantive significance. And for those of you who are interested, that's the score. I don't expect them to walk through that, but I just want to demonstrate that this is not fake news. There's real data here, okay? So having said that, that raises the question regarding whether or not we're actually measuring anything that's really useful. And by that I mean, does it actually tell us anything about the way in which real-world politics works? So the first thing that my co-author and I did was basically to see whether or not this measure passed the sniff test, so to speak. Because if we're actually capturing something that's meant to measure legislative effectiveness, we think it should be related to certain aspects of real-world politics that we think we know something about. And consistent with our expectations, it's clearly the case that those who are in the majority party are more effective or more successful than those in the minority party, as you'd expect. Those who are more senior members of the chamber tend to be more effective than those who are more junior, and in particular, those who are newly elected freshmen in the House as well as the Senate. And also it's the case that those who chair committees or alternatively subcommittees are notably more effective than rank and file members of the House that don't have these institutional positions of privilege. So that gave us some faith that what we were measuring was actually sensible. Beyond that, it was also interesting to note that these scores were also highly informative in terms of providing us with some guidance about the ways in which legislative politics works in the US Congress and the implications for legislative policymaking in Congress and members' careers both inside and outside of the chamber. So for example, we were able to demonstrate that if we take a look at a freshman's legislative effectiveness score, and by that I mean this is a score someone gets in their first 2 years in Congress. This is before they have any institutional privileges, they're newly elected, they haven't gotten any seniority beyond their first term. So whatever things we think would normally relate to someone becoming more successful, this is really their rookie year, so to speak. So if we take a look at someone's freshman legislative effectiveness score and we see whether or not they're essentially high or low flyers, this helps predict, or this is positively related to a lot of interesting aspects associated with their subsequent careers. And more specifically, we found that essentially those who are high flyers in their freshman class were 50% more likely to run for higher office within their next 10 years in Congress, either looking to run for the US Senate or alternatively the governor's races. In some cases, some of these individuals actually tried to make a run for the White House. In contrast, those who were relatively ineffective in the freshman class, they did not hit the ground running, they were relatively unsuccessful at advancing their agenda items, they were 50% more likely to actually voluntarily leave the chamber. And by that I mean they did not get knocked out, they did not lose their election. Sometime in the next 10 years they just decided simply to resign or alternatively not stand for re-election. So looking at where someone is, even their first 2 years of Congress, before they've amassed seniority, just gain a sense of really, are they go-getters, are they successful, can provide us with some guidance regarding who's likely to be successful in future chambers or future Congresses, as well as who's likely to try to stick around and advance their careers in perhaps the Senate or higher office, or alternatively perhaps leave politics altogether. Likewise, we might want to ask ourselves, what might it be about individuals' past experiences or their personal traits that might be positively related to them being effective lawmakers? And one point that's been raised to us by many individuals is that perhaps it's the case that people that already have had some on-the-job training, having served in state legislatures, for example, might be highly effective lawmakers if they get elected to Congress. That's a very, what we thought was a very natural conjecture, which we were able to explore with the data. And what we found was very interesting here as well. So essentially, we found that those individuals who had served as state legislators in what are, for lack of a better phrase, is referred to as highly professionalized state legislatures, more or less mini Congresses, so California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York, those individuals, who, once they're elected to Congress, they are notably more effective than individuals who had not served in state legislatures. That being said, those individuals who served in less professionalized state legislatures, so for example, Virginia, Tennessee, many of the southern states, many of the Great Plains states, those individuals, after they were elected to the US Congress, were actually notably less effective than people who had had no state legislative experience whatsoever. So bluntly speaking, it might be the case that those who came from Virginia clearly learned some lessons as to how to engage in legislative policymaking, but those lessons didn't help them very much, or in fact might have harmed them once they actually got to Congress. In comparison to those who were elected from highly professionalized state legislatures, they've already been working in an environment that's quite similar to what we see in the US Congress, and as a result, it seems they're able to carry their experiences over to the next chamber. Another question that people might ask is whether or not there's systematic differences in regards to gender, so male versus female lawmakers. This is an increasingly timely topic, and our research can engage with this as well. We actually had a finding that emerged from an earlier paper that we published in 2013 prior to the book that demonstrated pretty robustly that female lawmakers on our metric are notably more effective than male lawmakers, particularly if they're in the minority party. So, and by that I mean, in the current Congress, for example, Democratic women are going to be notably more effective than Democratic men in advancing their legislative agendas. Okay, in the next Congress, things are going to be changing quite a bit, obviously, with the turnover in the House. This finding, as you might imagine, received quite a bit of media attention. People were quite interested in it, so we had coverage in the New York Times, the Washington Post. My personal favorite was being highlighted in Self magazine, directly following an article on how to have rock-hard abs, so that was always my dream. Moving past these points, one other aspect of my and my co-authors' ongoing research is to engage in public outreach in various ways. So for those of you who are interested, we have a website titled www.thelawmakers.org, which has all of our data up on the website. It has a very user-friendly interface such that individuals could essentially click on a map of the United States and identify at any point in time for both the House and the Senate. We now go from 1973 up until 2016. We're in the process of coding up the current Congress, which is in conclusion. You can identify in this case, this is a snapshot of Tennessee from the 114th Congress. That's 2015 to 2016, for those of you who don't speak Congressese. You could identify essentially every member of the Tennessee House delegation, as well as Tennessee senators. You can identify what their scores are. You can also identify what we identify as a benchmark score. And the benchmark score is essentially what you would expect someone with that person's level of seniority, whether or not they're in the majority or minority party, as well as whether or not they have a committee chair, what we'd expect that score to be. And we're able to identify whether or not someone is systematically above or below their expected benchmark, as well as identifying their rank within their party. And putting all of this together, myself and my co-author are currently co-directors of what's an institution that's referred to as the Center for Effective Lawmaking, which is a formal partnership between Vanderbilt University and the Frank Baden School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. The mission of the center is to advance the generation, communication, and use of knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and legislative institutions. And to do so, we're engaging in a multi-year research project in which we're working on a variety of research papers, which will ultimately culminate in a new book, which we're tentatively titling Building a Better Congress. So we're very interested in trying to understand, in the bluntest terms, how might we be able to essentially identify individuals who are likely to be effective lawmakers in Congress even before they're elected? What is it about people's previous occupations, their training, their personal backgrounds, demographics, who they might represent, how they campaign and the like, that might be correlated, positively correlated with their success in the chamber? Beyond identification, we're also very interested in the process of cultivation. Upon someone being elected to the US Congress, what strategies might they employ, or how might they be empowered by legislative or party leaders in order to successfully advance their legislative agendas? Or alternatively, thinking about the current Congress, what is it that leaders might or might not do that might actually inhibit individuals' ability to advance their legislative agendas and represent their constituents in certain ways? And the third aspect of the project is focused on questions of accountability. And this has obviously been a big issue, or at least an issue that some members are wrestling with in light of current debates. To what degree do constituents even care about their members being effective lawmakers? Obviously, someone can be a very cognizant and competent representative without actually advancing bills in and of itself. But if it's the case that constituents do want their representatives or senators to advance bills, we want to understand what this potential accountability relationship is. Do we see representatives and senators promoting themselves as effective legislators? If they are, do constituents actually respond in a positive way? Or is it basically the case that there's a huge disconnect between everything that happens in Washington and the ways in which you as voters learn about them, and as well as what influences your perspectives in the voting booth? So just to briefly identify some of the areas which we're doing some research on, I'm happy to answer questions about these in the Q&A. With regards to identification, as I said before, we've been focusing on the relationship between legislative effectiveness and prior legislative experience. I already focused on the relationship of prior legislative experience in state legislatures, but we're also able to demonstrate that those individuals who were elected from the House and then move into the US Senate, there's a strong positive relationship between how successful they were in the House and how successful they are in the Senate. Bluntly speaking, if someone is a highly effective representative on our scale when they're in the US House, they're going to continue to be a highly effective representative once they get to the Senate. If someone's a low performer or basically a dud in the House, they're going to be a dud in the Senate. Previous House service in and of itself does not really count, okay? I spoke to the point regarding women being, on average, more effective than men. We're also exploring the relationship to see if one exists between educational backgrounds and legislative effectiveness. Can we infer anything about someone's ability to advance their legislative agendas based on where they went to college, law school, graduate school, business school, and the like? We have an ongoing an ongoing project focusing on the relative legislative effectiveness of military veterans. And we're, in general, also exploring prior careers in a very broad setting, as well as thinking about the ways in which individuals actually present themselves to constituents. Can we infer something about whether or not someone is likely to be advancing their own agenda successfully based on whether or not they present themselves as, say, a bridge builder or compromiser during the campaign, or alternatively, they essentially present themselves as a partisan? These are some interesting questions which right now we don't have answers to. With regards to cultivation, we've actually established a collection of the habits of highly effective lawmakers that came out of our first book. We've demonstrated in the US House, at least, there's a systematic bias against women's issues legislation that are sponsored by women, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of the talk today. There is an interesting relationship that we've demonstrated between how ideological members of the US House are and how successful they are at advancing their agendas. Be happy to talk about that as well. Given ongoing discussions about the need to either impose impose term limits on legislators or expand them perhaps, we actually have some pretty tight research that was written up in the Washington Post last year that demonstrated that it's clearly the case that the imposition of term limits on committee chairs in the US House that have been in place on the Republican side since 1995 led to a huge decrease in the relative effectiveness of those committee chairs. So we can demonstrate a huge drop-off in the ability of Republican committee chairs to get their agendas through the legislative process that matches up precisely at the point that the Republicans impose committee chair term limits. So even though some of us might be proponents of term limits under the expectation that might enhance democratic accountability, that might be true, but it's important to note that in an effort to enhance democratic accountability, there's clearly some sort of drop-off in terms of institutional expertise that makes it more and more difficult for these committee leaders to actually advance the agendas of their parties. We have demonstrated very nicely as well in both the House and the Senate that contrary to the way it's being portrayed in the mainstream media, bipartisanship is both not dead and it's actually quite useful in terms of trying to advance one's agendas. So more bipartisan lawmakers, as evidenced by how they co-sponsor legislation of members of the other party, are notably more effective than those individuals who are not bipartisan in nature. From a management perspective, we're also able to really get into the weeds to demonstrate that, at least on the House side, there's a very strong positive relationship between the ability of members to hire highly experienced legislative staff and their ability to get their legislative policies through the process. In the simplest terms, if a newly elected member were to hire his or her campaign staff and go to Washington to manage his or her office, that would not be very constructive. And we could point precisely to where in the data they would run into problems. We are also able to demonstrate very neatly as well that party or individual legislators who join intra-party factions, such as the Tea Party caucus, for example, the Freedom Caucus, and so on and so forth, it's clearly the case that joining these party factions does not necessarily help you unless your party's in the minority party. So currently, and by currently I mean as of today until the Congress turns over in January, Republicans who are currently identifying themselves as being within the Freedom Caucus are actually going to be notably less effective than those Republicans who are not in the Freedom Caucus, because the Republican Party leadership is, for all intents and purposes, systematically trying to put these factions down. Whereas with the Republicans switching over into the minority party in the next Congress, we'd actually probably expect that those individuals who are in the Freedom Caucus might be more effective than those who are not in the Freedom Caucus, largely because the Democratic Party leadership in the House might be doing what they can to embolden the Freedom Caucus to facilitate greater factionalism in the parties. With regards to accountability, as I said before, this is a question, or this is an area for which there's a lot of questions. Do voters care about legislative effectiveness at all? More importantly, if they're presented with information about legislative effectiveness, does this influence their voting decisions? It goes without saying that members of Congress clearly believe that voters care about this in some way. or at the very least, they want to go out of their way to articulate ways in which they're able to influence the legislative process. There's a classic book written by a prominent political scientist, Richard Fenno, from the 1960s, or early 1970s, pardon me, in which he spent years, essentially, following a handful of members of Congress through their districts to identify the ways in which they interact with their constituents on a day-by-day basis. And there's a nice soundbite from that book that essentially says that every member of Congress keeps in the back of his, or well, back then it said his, but his or her mind, a speech that can be rattled off at a moment's notice that identifies the ways in which he or she is an effective wielder of the tools of power in the United States Congress. Okay, that was a sentiment that was expressed in the 1960s, the 1970s, and going on to now. But of course, this raises questions regarding whether or not voters even care about this and the ways in which individuals refer to themselves vis-a-vis effective lawmaking practices. So the following here is a blog posting that was presented by Representative Hank Johnson. This was back in October 2014. This is right around the time that our book was published. We actually had a really nice event at the National Press Club that was jointly sponsored by Vanderbilt University and the University of Virginia, in which the website was launched. And within basically about a week, there were a variety of newspaper stories focusing on legislative effectiveness, and many members of the US House at the time actually picked up on this and highlighted how effective they were. So at least some members clearly want to highlight how effective they are in the public forum. So as I said, Hank Johnson blogged about it. Actually, he wrote an op-ed, pardon me. They write op-eds. We see a situation in which John Conyers actually tweeted about it. So we see situations in which highly effective members clearly want to highlight the extent to which they are effective wielders of power. Interestingly enough, it's not necessarily the case that less effective members want to draw attention to this. In fact, the following is actually a soundbite that was taken from an article in the Indianapolis Star. A journalist from the Indianapolis Star wrote up about an incumbent or a past member of Congress and his relative ineffectiveness on our scale. And the person's chief of staff came out and said, and I quote, "Clearly the authors don't understand how Congress works." Unfortunately, we were not able to get that on the dust jacket. Moving on to more recent data. So when we released our scores for the United States Senate about a year and a half ago, once again, this is the first time the Senate scores have been publicized, and we saw a similar uptake on the part of high performers. So Senator Orrin Hatch's office, this might be difficult to read, as soon as this was within basically about 2 days of our scores being launched, said the Center for Effective Lawmaking uses math is in quotation, so I'm not sure why that is, uses math to calculate effectiveness based on the number of factors. They tweeted our formula, and then he engaged in a variety, or released many media or press releases that identified precisely his score, how effective he is compared to the average member of the Senate, as well as a long-term trajectory of his effectiveness in the Senate going back for many years. So it's clearly the case that members of the US Senate and Congress believe this is relevant. The question is, what do you as voters think about this, which is where we're going to be going next. Now, at this point, I want to take a slight digression. This has nothing to do with Congress. My wife is a veterinarian, and whenever she engages in continuing education, she likes to point out to me how bad my slides are, and she urges me to sprinkle it with something involving dog humor. So for those of you who might have started to tune out once you saw that, hopefully this could bring everyone back for where we're going next. So if you get one thing out of this, just remember, golden doodles can in fact sit in swings. Okay, so having said that, if we think about accountability, as I said before, we're going to talk about whether or not we're seeking to explore whether or not constituents know or care about the lawmaking effectiveness of their representatives or senators, the relationship between effective lawmakers and campaign contributions, the relationship between effective lawmakers and committee assignments or reassignments. And likewise, if we think about the ongoing electoral environment, we also want to see whether or not that members of Congress, either on the House or the Senate side, might perhaps cultivate a harmful reputation in the eyes of their constituents by engaging in political compromise. So, having said that, what I'd like to do now is turn to consideration of the 2018 midterm elections, which is obviously more or less still ongoing. And by that I mean, the figures I have up here, you'll notice there's a TBD there, okay? These numbers are based more or less on what are definitive numbers as presented by a variety of media sources, but obviously we still have some seats that have yet to be definitively called. But it's to provide you with a more or less accurate snapshot of the ways in which the 116th Congress is going to look. We will have at least 225 Democrats and 200 Republicans. If I had to handicap this, I would guess we'd probably end up with about 230 Democrats, maybe even more, depending on how things break. At this point, and by that I mean as of a couple days ago, it was the case that Democrats had won at least 33 seats from Republicans. And at least we're going to see, we're going to see at least 86 new representatives walking into the chamber. Okay? With respect to the Senate, this is up to date as of essentially a day and a half ago. We know we will have 47 Democrats in the Senate and 51 Republicans. We have 2 other seats that have still yet to be determined. Both the Florida race and the Mississippi race are still a bit up in the air for different reasons. And that being said, we will likewise have, at the moment, 7 new senators coming in. Okay? This is a pretty substantial shakeup if we think about the ways in which the chamber has the party's fates have vacillated across the last 10 to 15 years. And in the context of what I was describing just a little bit earlier, this raises some interesting questions regarding the relative effectiveness of outgoing and incoming legislators. Given this infusion of new blood, do we expect to see some natural high flyers in this new cohort? Do we expect individuals to be able to advance the legislative agenda, or are we likely to see gridlock as normal? So a couple of points to note, just drawing attention to data. When we think about this shakeup in terms of 86 new representatives coming in, we might want to ask ourselves essentially who is not returning and what do they look like in terms of their relative ability or success at advancing legislation. So with respect to the House, if we take a look at the collection of everyone who served in the current Congress or is serving in the current Congress, the 115th Congress, who is not returning to the 116th. And by that I mean these are people who could have been elected back in 2016 who are not reelected, or alternatively, they are people who ended up being appointed for various reasons or being elected through special election. Okay, but the entire collection of individuals who served in the chamber at some point over the last 2 years who are not returning, we can see that the average level of seniority of these members, meaning the average number of terms that they'd actually served in Congress, is about 6.3. So on average, these people had served roughly about 12 and a half years in Congress. Okay? On the one hand, that sounds like a lot of years, and we definitely know from our research there's a very positive correlation between seniority and legislative effectiveness. So on one hand, it seems as though this could be problematic because we're losing quite a bit of institutional expertise. But it's important to realize that if we compare this to the previous election, the election before that, and the election before that, 6.3 is pretty close to where the average turnover has been. That being said, it might be useful to think about the way in which the world looked like during the first election following President Obama's election to office in 2008. So the 2010 elections, as President Obama noted, I believe he said they were shellacked, the Democrats. And it's interesting to note that even though the number of members that ended up departing office following Obama's first midterm was actually roughly about the same. It was slightly more than what we're seeing in the current election, actually, for different reasons. The average number of terms that those members had served was actually less. So what I'm saying is, if we think about the first midterm that the Obama administration dealt with to the first midterm that the Trump administration is dealing with now, there's been a notable increase in collective seniority that's departing the House in comparison to Obama, which raises some questions regarding who's likely to be coming in. Related to that point, if we take a look at the incumbents who are currently in the 115th Congress today, or they sort of are, we have data on 84 of those members in our data set from the 114th Congress. Remember, we haven't calculated legislative effectiveness scores for the current Congress because we can't do it until the Congress is concluded. But we can tell you how successful these individuals were at advancing the legislative agendas 2 Congresses ago. And of those 84 members, it's important to note that 24 of these members who are not coming back are, quote-unquote, above expectations, meaning that they're consistently more successful than we'd expect them to be given their party status, how senior they are in the chamber, as well as whether or not they hold committee chairs or subcommittee chairs. And if we think about some of these individuals who are above expectations, it's important to note that many of them have decided to retire. It's not the case that they lost re-election, they just decided to extricate themselves from the chamber altogether. So some high-profile retirements from a legislative effectiveness perspective includes Representative Bill Schuster, who represented Pennsylvania's 9th District as a Republican, as well as Ed Royce, who represented California's 39th District as a Republican. It's also the case that some of these high flyers clearly were trying to, consistent with our previous research, were clearly trying to advance their careers in other institutional forums. And in this case, we can point to many high flyers who explicitly were trying to move to the Senate. Some of these names I'm sure are quite familiar given the focus of the media attention on these races, even though they are not from Tennessee. So for example, Beto O'Rourke, who is a high flyer in our data. He was essentially one of the most overperforming congressmen within his cohort. He obviously was trying to move to the Senate. And interestingly enough, in the case of Arizona, both Martha McSally and Kristen Sinema were both overperformers in our data. Both of them, in fact, Martha McSally was more or less the rookie of the year in her Republican class, according to our legislative effectiveness data. And Kristen Sinema, even though her score is notably lower than Martha McSally because she's a Democrat, she's the minority party, she also is essentially an overperformer. They were both highly effective lawmakers in the US House. They're relatively junior, consistent with our expectations. They both sought higher office. And as some of you might have known, if you've been paying attention to these races, the race was decided or conceded by Martha McSally in favor of Sinema officially about a day ago. Okay? It's also the case, consistent with our analysis, that some of these highly effective lawmakers also sought higher office as state governors. So consistent with that, we see Jared Polis, who the recently elected Democratic governor from Colorado. He's also one of these high performers in the 114th Congress who tried successfully to attain higher office. Kristi Noem, Republican from North Dakota, also a high flyer. And likewise, Tim Walz, Democrat from Minnesota's 1st District, also an overperformer, so to speak. All three of these individuals were highly performing lawmakers in the 114th Congress. They have chosen to run for higher office. They've succeeded in this case, and they will not be returning to the 116th Congress. Now, that being said, we might want to ask ourselves, who's replacing them? What does this incoming cohort look like so far? Obviously, the data is evolving in real time, but there's some interesting things to point out. One is of the individuals who we know unambiguously are going to be seated in the 116th Congress, and just talking about the US House for the moment, 24 of these incoming representatives served in their own state legislatures at some point in the past. Most of these individuals came directly from their state legislatures. Of those individuals, in addition to those 24 individuals, it's also the case that two of them, Ed Case, who's a Democrat from Hawaii, and Ann Kirkpatrick, who's a Democrat from Arizona, previously actually served in the US House of Representatives. Both of them, as a matter of trivia, are also high performers in our data set. So based on their past performance in the US House, even though they're freshmen, so to speak, they're kind of super freshmen. They had been there before. We'd expect them to be highly successful and highly effective moving into the current Congress. It's also the case of these 24 individuals who previously served in state legislatures, 4 of them served in highly professionalized state legislatures. As defined, as I said before, these are more or less mini Congresses. These are state legislatures that meet year-round. They have relatively high salaries. They have relatively high staff levels in comparison to other state legislatures that, for example, some of the states in the Great Plains meet no more than 40 days a year, sometimes no more than 40 days every other year. Okay, that's clearly different than what we see when we think about California, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio to some degree, okay? So if you were to ask yourself, who do we expect to be some of the high flyers in this year's freshman class coming in, I would say our research would suggest that Anthony Brindisi from New York, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, Guy Reichenthal from Pennsylvania, and Madeline Dean, also from Pennsylvania. All of them are Democrats. That's not a coincidence. The Democrats have obviously picked up quite a bit in this freshman class at the moment. But these 4 individuals have actually all come from highly professionalized state legislatures. We do have Republicans who are also coming into the freshman class who also have state legislative experience. But essentially all of the Republicans who are coming into this year's freshman class and have state legislative experience are being drawn from either highly non-professionalized state legislatures, those that don't meet very often or essentially have very low staffing levels, or we would say essentially average state legislatures in terms of professionalization. So it's not clear whether or not they necessarily benefit from their prior state legislative experience. But these 4, we might expect them to be highly effective lawmakers in the House and serve to be the next generation's leaders. Coming back to a point that I was raising a little bit earlier regarding whether or not there's any clear influence or at least relationship between gender and legislative effectiveness in Congress, it's important to really dive into the data here. So just to give you a sense of the way the world looks today, or did more or less over the last couple months, the current Congress, the 115th Congress, if you combine the House and the Senate, 107 women are sitting in the chambers respectively. And as a practical matter, we see 23 in the Senate, 17 Democrat, 6 Republican. In the House, as I said before, we have 84, 61 Democrat, 23rd Republican. So in both parties, we see the number of women is disproportionately drawn from Democrats rather than the Republican Party. Looking ahead to the forthcoming Congress, the 116th Congress, we still need to wait. We still have 10 seats that are up for grabs. It's still not entirely clear what's going to happen with some of the Senate. But we know with certainty that at least 125 women are going to be seated in the 116th Congress. Now, as a benchmark, if we think back to 1992, the elections of 1992 that had been denoted by a wide array of observers as the quote-unquote year of the woman, that was a time in which 54 women ended up serving in Congress. So there were 48 in the House, 6 in the Senate. So across what is now 26-ish years, we've seen a pretty substantial uptick in the scope of female representation in both the House and the Senate. That being said, it's important to note that it's still clearly the case that female representation in the U.S. House and Senate is still well below 50%. We're essentially about 23-ish%. We will expect there to be 23 women in the Senate moving forward. 17 of those are Democrats, 6 are Republican. So nothing has really changed on net in comparison to the previous Congress. We will have at least 102 women in the U.S. House. That's to be determined. We still have a bunch of races that need to sort themselves out. Of that, 90 of them are Democrat and 12 are Republican. So once again, we've seen a dwindling on the Republican side in terms of the scope, or at least the ability, to attract female candidates that are sufficiently electorally viable to promote them to office. It's also important to note that if we think about the incoming freshman class, 35 of them, or at least 35 of them, are going to be female. So we have a situation in which we're coming very close to almost 50% of the incoming class in the House is female. Which, of course, building on earlier research, we might want to ask ourselves, are there any implications for likely effectiveness with regards to advancing one's legislative agendas for these both newly elected female members of Congress as well as the chamber as a whole? So I just want to highlight or re-highlight or re-emphasize some of the earlier findings that I drew attention to. One is, as I said before, we have a very robust empirical finding that emerges from our analysis of both the House and the Senate that female legislators are notably more effective than their male counterparts when they're in the minority party. In the majority party, in the Senate, there's essentially no difference in terms of the relative success of female versus male legislators. In the minority party, however, there's substantial differences in both the House and the Senate regarding the ability of female legislators to get their agendas through the process. So if we try to project these findings onto this incoming Congress, we might want to ask ourselves, who among the incoming minority party, that being the Republican Party, might we expect to be particularly effective given that she's female? Of that, we have one. So there is one incoming freshman Republican who is female, that being Carol Miller from West Virginia, who's representing the 3rd District. Our research would suggest that on average, she's going to be notably more effective than her male counterparts in the freshman Republican class. Related to this, we might want to ask ourselves, what does this notable increase in the number of women members of the House and Senate mean for the advancement of different types of policies? Myself and my co-author, as well as a third co-author, we have a recently published paper focusing explicitly on the progression or lack thereof of traditionally women's issues legislation in comparison to men. And what we're able to demonstrate very robustly by consideration of data, essentially going from the 1970s up until about 2010, is female legislators are unambiguously more likely to advance the types of issues that are more traditionally associated with quote-unquote women's issues than men. So if we think about issues dealing with health, education, labor practices, et cetera, it's unambiguously the case that women are more likely to introduce these bills than men are in the U.S. House. And I can't speak to the Senate, but we have reasons to believe it carries over to the Senate as well. Now, it's also important to note, if we take a step back, it's really, really, really hard to get a bill through the legislative process from start to finish, okay? I mean, it goes without saying. So in any given Congress on the U.S. House side, in contemporary times, we might see as many as 8,000 to 9,000 bills introduced. At best, on average, about 4% of them will ultimately become law, okay? That being said, it's interesting to note that women's issues in particular are notably harder than the non-women's issues bills to advance. So whereas 4% of all bills become law, it's the case that only 2% of bills dealing with quote-unquote women's issues successfully advance to becoming law. And of that, we are also able to find in the data a very robust pattern that only 1% of women's issues bills that are sponsored by women become law. So according to a very long-term analysis of data dating by over 30 plus years, it's the case that, first of all, as gridlocked, as hard as it is to get bills through the process, it's even harder for women's issues bills, and it's even harder if women are advocating for women's issues bills in comparison to men advocating for them. What does this mean? Well, at the very least, it goes without saying we'd expect that given this notable increase in the number of women that are entering the US House and Senate, we'd expect there to at least be an increase in the number of bills that are advocating for what we think of as traditionally women's issues. So there should be a change in the scope of the legislative agenda. And given these large sample results that we could point to across the scope of the last 30-ish years, with more bills being introduced, we'd also expect that there'd probably be a higher number of bills that ultimately find their way into law, given this notable influx of women. So with that hopefully provides you with a pretty broad overview of many of the research projects I'm involved in, some of the broader findings regarding legislative effectiveness in the US House and Senate, as well as what the implications of these findings might be for ongoing congressional deliberations moving into 116th in January 2019. So with that, I believe we have about 28-ish minutes if there's any questions. Please.
I was really interested in your, if I understand you right, that after 2 years, after one, you can pretty well predict how long, who are going to be the people that are going to not make it very long in the House of Representatives.
On the House side, the Senate side been done.
If I were a political strategist, I would be looking at those as the low-hanging fruit that would be, if I was the opposing party, that would be likely, good people to be targeted, likely to, at their 4-year mark, be easy to have the other person win.
Potentially.
Are you seeing any sort of, is your data being used in that sort of way?
That's a really good question. Our data now is being used in campaigns, notably more than what it had been over the last few years. So it's finding its way into the public domain. If I did a Google search on the lawmakers.org or Center for Effective Lawmaking, you could come up with a lot of ads, actually including Martha McSally, who highlighted her score by the Center for Effective Lawmaking to illustrate how effective she was. It's also definitely the case that low-performing members are being targeted by people running against them, or at least some low-performing members. President Trump actually pointed to the Center for Effective Lawmaking when campaigning for Joe Donnelly's opponent, Mike Braun, in Indiana, pointing out that Joe Donnelly, I believe you referred to him as quote-unquote Sleeping Joe, had been ranked as the least effective member of the Democratic delegation in the 114th Congress. So we're definitely seeing our data being incorporated in some ways, not systematically, but in some ways into offices. We have not dived into the data yet to see whether or not we're seeing an increase in the rise of quality, or if there's a relationship between the rise of quality challengers and low-performing members. In the broad sense, one thing we can point to, though, is a relationship that exists between prior vote share and legislative effectiveness, in the sense that the most effective lawmakers in our data are ones that are not electorally insecure. So those who are essentially just got by the skin of their teeth in their prior election, they tend to score pretty low in our data. It's also the case that those who are really, really, really secure, those who basically ran unopposed, or alternatively, they ran against opposition, but they got 80+% of the vote share, or even upper 70s, they also are not incredibly effective in our data. The sweet spot, so to speak, are those people who are safe enough that they, to us, we wouldn't think they need to be running scared, someone who's getting about 65% of the vote, but they're not so super safe they never have to think about it. As to why that's happening, we have conjectures, but we're not entirely sure. The one point, coming back to a question that you're implicitly speaking to, is we might want to ask ourselves, under what conditions do we think potential competitors might view themselves as being more or less viable? One thing we could definitely point to, even the most recent cycle, both this current one and previous ones, is definitely the case that relatively low performers just decide to give up. By that, they just decide not, we could point to many of them at least. And at the time they've announced their intentions not to run for re-election, many of them, including one who represents my co-author's district, said explicitly, I just can't get anything done, this isn't what I signed up for, et cetera. Does that necessarily mean that his district would be targeted for switching? Not necessarily, because ultimately if it's still a Republican district, it might be very difficult for a Democrat to be viable. But it might definitely be the case in some of these districts, you might see much more viable competition at the primary level, depending on how, or being related to how engaged people are in the legislative environment. So we'll see. Yes, please, and then I'll work way back. Yes.
Fascinating about partisanship is greater than everyone believes.
Mm-hmm.
The data that you collected to conclude that, what does it consist of? Then looking forward, where's the data we can kind of monitor it ourselves?
Sure. Sure. So there's a couple of sources. Sorry, let me restate the question. So the question was, he was very interested in noting my claim that bipartisanship tends to be more, or appears to be more valuable in the legislative chamber than we've been led to believe, and he wanted to know essentially where is that data drawn from, or alternative, or related to that, how could we collectively monitor such data to get a sense of what's going on. So the data we're using for that is essentially patterns of co-sponsorship, bill co-sponsorship behaviors between members of the U.S. House to other members of the U.S. House. So whether or not, if I'm a Republican and you're a Democrat, how likely I am to co-sponsor bills that are introduced by you and vice versa. And we're able to demonstrate pretty robustly that those individuals who systematically or consistently reach across the aisle and at least co-sponsor bills that are advocated by the other party, and likewise, they're able to attract co-sponsors from the other party, tend to be notably more successful at getting their bills out of committee and in some cases passing the House. The same result holds true for the Senate than those who essentially don't form bipartisan coalitions, at least during the co-sponsorship stage. So we have data on that. If you're interested, though, in terms of some publicly available data, I mean, we have it. I'm happy to give it to you in spreadsheet form, but that might not be too fun. The Lugar Center, which is an institution that's founded entirely towards facilitating, or around the goal of facilitating bipartisanship, the Lugar Center comes up as devised what they refer to as the Bipartisanship Index, which provides people with a nice summary score or summary statistic as to how bipartisan people are in their co-sponsorship behaviors. It's a little different from what we do. They have a slightly more convoluted formula for it, but the correlation between their data and our data is very, very high. So that's publicly available. The Lugar Center works with the Georgetown University Public Policy School to come up with the index. This is named after a former senator from Indiana, Lugar, Dick Lugar. So that'd be a place you could find the data very easily. There was a hand way back. Yes, please.
I'm curious, your claim of the term limits on the congressional committees, and whether the decline in effectiveness is simply related to the loss of institutional knowledge, or whether there's some evidence that the committee chairs behave differently when they know it's only for a set amount of time.
Did everyone hear the question? Or just to restate, she was asking me about the finding we have regarding the decrease in effectiveness that correlates with the imposition of committee chairs or committee chair term limits, and wondering whether or not that's indicative of a loss of institutional knowledge, or whether or not that's indicative of individual committee chairs behaving differently in light of these term limits. That's a great question, and let me say openly, I kind of mushed that up in the sense that I believe it's the case that we have a decrease in institutional knowledge because of these term limits. But we could point, I mean, going beyond the data, we could also point to the scope of staff turnover that has occurred on these committees post-term limits compared to what happened before. And if we believe that legislative expertise or institutional knowledge is correlated with staff staying in place, we have reasons to believe that the imposition of term limits is clearly related to an increase in staff turnover. But I completely agree with the other point you're making. I expect, or I think it's entirely reasonable, and truthfully I do expect, that in light of committee term limits, committee chair term limits as well as subcommittee chair term limits, we have a situation, at least on the Republican side, that members of Congress are thinking very differently about how to cultivate their policy portfolios and their scope of policy expertise. Because of the fact that if you know at best you could be a committee chair for 6 years, this is going to influence the extent to which you really want to engage with a certain topic unless there's a clear electoral benefit to doing so. And talking with members anecdotally and their staffs, some people are very open about the extent to which developing policy expertise is a high or low priority to their member, and that's consistent with this point that I'm raising. If the best you could essentially hope for is maybe 6 years of controlling the committee, this is going to influence your desire to really undertake that task. One point which I didn't highlight here, but we could definitely see this on the Republican side, is we always see a pretty significant increase in the number of Republicans that choose to retire from Congress at the time that their committee chair term limit starts to be binding. So which we never saw on the Democratic side because there were no committee chair term limits. But it's definitely the case that some of the most highly effective members in the Republican caucus in the early aughts, essentially, once they had committee chair term limits binding, these people decided not to stand for re-election. So given that some of these people were highly effective and they explicitly decided not to stand for re-election because they can't control, well, maybe because they can't control the committee chair anymore, that at least suggests the institution is losing expertise in that regard. So, yes, please.
Is there anything you could say about the effectiveness of the Tennessee delegation?
You could go to www.thelawmakers.org. I would say in the 114th Congress, which is the most recent data we have up there, Tennessee typically does not have high flyers per se. Senator Alexander tends to be on average, essentially where you'd expect him to be in terms of benchmark. I might actually have it up here. Let me back up so we can at least get the snapshot of the senators. The dog, there you go. So this is actually the snapshot if you look today. So taking a look at Senator Alexander and Senator Corker in the 114th Congress at least, both of their scores place them essentially within expectations. That's what you'd expect their score to be close to given the number of terms they've served in Congress, their committee chair status, and the fact they're in the majority party. Working our way down, Steve Cohen, I know it might be difficult for some of you to see this. Steve Cohen from Tennessee's 9th District, at least in the 114th Congress, he was above expectations. Given that he was in the minority party, he was scoring higher than you would have expected him to. Jim Cooper, there's a little red X there, which suggests that he's below expectations, meaning given that, in bluntly speaking, the number of terms that he's been in Congress, compared to the average member of the minority party that's been in Congress for as many terms, you would have expected Congressman Cooper, at least in the 114th, to be more effective at advancing legislation than he was. But it's varied over time. In truthfully the most recent Congresses, we as Tennesseans tend not to have a bunch of high flyers in our delegation. So let me start over here and I'll work. Yes, please.
Are there other measures of effectiveness that you haven't considered, such as charisma, the ability to organize a caucus, that kind of thing? Or are they so correlated with the measures that you have presented?
No, that's a great question. So, which I'm going to rephrase the question. The question was, are there other measures of effectiveness, such as charisma or the ability to organize a caucus, which we haven't considered here, or are they so highly correlated? I think that question also speaks to the broader question in terms of, what does it mean to be an effective legislator? We are defining effectiveness to have a very specific, or we're characterizing effectiveness as having a very specific definition, and that being the demonstrated ability to move one's own issue agenda items through the legislative process from start to finish. And by that I mean these are the bills that someone introduces. That being said, if we think about the contemporary lawmaking process, it's very often the case, so at least anecdotally, we could point to individuals who are successful navigators of the legislative process, but they're not advancing their own bills, they're working behind the scenes. We can't account for any of that in this data. Likewise also, and truthfully this comes back almost to a question related to yours, that being what do we as constituents think about when we think about someone being an effective legislator? It could be, depending on your constituency, that you really don't care whether or not your member of Congress is advancing his or her bills, but you might care quite a bit about whether or not they're engaging in debate on the floor or on committees that represents your views in some ways. Likewise, we can't speak to that with this data. We could only talk about a very specific definition about advancing one's own one's own agenda items. Some of these issues regarding charisma, we have to ask ourselves how to measure that, but there are other scholars that are building on our research right now that are actually using the scores to see to what degree they correlate with, say, personal attractiveness, speech patterns. I mean, literally, essentially, how people engage with each other on the U.S. House or the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. Are they adversarial? Are they more open? How does that relate to effectiveness? So our metric has really spurred on a lot of ongoing research that builds into some of these other directions, which we don't measure directly. So there were hands over there. Yes, please.
Just out of curiosity, what state has the best legislatures?
Do you mean state legislatures, you mean? Oh, it's going to vary really across time. We could find high flyers coming from many, many, many states across time. It's not the case that one state, we don't have a state that produces presidents the same way we do in Congress. So, but we could, and on both parties, this isn't a Democratic or Republican issue. We could find high flyers in both parties across a wide array of states. So, that being said, I mean, Hawaii tends to be pretty low. I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that. But Alaska, actually, just as a counterpoint, it's not, I mean, Alaska has consistently elected Don Young for many, 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 many years. And he's, I mean, Alaska, it's out there. I mean, geographically, you know, you wouldn't naturally expect this to be just, you know, a proving ground for legislative effectiveness, but Don Young has consistently been one of the most high-performing legislators in the U.S. Congress, regardless of whether or not he's in the majority or minority party. So, yeah, way in the back, please.
Following up on that gentleman's comments, I've heard legislators argue on the re-election, being president of the district is really important, away from it, and that's all over the soft things. Something that happened a few years ago was they put the back on the ability to do earmarks. And you bring up somebody like Don Young, who's, you know, or like legislators who do type work, Virginia, sort of sink under the military. How much, if any, do you see the diminution in the ability to bring earmarks across back to the quote?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, there are, well, a couple points to note. Even though we haven't explored earmark data in our own analysis, there are other scholars that have, let me just restate the question. Sorry if that wasn't clear. He was essentially asking, with the ban on earmarks that was implemented by previous Republican Congresses, and by that these are basically add-ons to legislation that explicitly identify dollars to be distributed back to specific geographic locations. He was curious to know how the ban on earmarks might have either contributed to or perhaps inhibited legislative effectiveness in Congress. And what I would say is, to restate, that's a great question. We haven't analyzed the earmark data ourselves, but there are other scholars who've been engaging precisely that point. A couple points to note is that it appears that there's a very strong positive relationship between earmark delivery and our measures of legislative effectiveness. So it's clearly the case that those who are successful at securing, I mean, what constitutes an earmark is open for debate, but what we conventionally view as earmarks are also those who are successful at advancing their own legislative goals. With the formal ban of earmarks, though, we might want to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the legislative process? I think most any member of the House, even if they weren't pressed, they'd be pretty open to say that this was not very constructive in terms of facilitating legislative compromise. In the grand scheme of things, earmark spending is completely de minimis compared to the scope of federal spending that's spent on all sorts of things, some of which are hardwired into the budget, some that aren't. But, you know, earmarks, for all intents and purposes, were really the grease that kept the wheels going along in a lot of cases. So, especially on legislation that some members of the House might not have any strong incentive to vote for, they might not be violently opposed to it, but they have no incentive to vote for, being able to distribute some dollars back to the district that's clearly important to them and their constituencies, that was pretty cheap, and now that's been taken off the table. So that means that legislators, to be successful, they really have to engage in other coalition-building activities, which, depending on the composition of the chamber and how potentially partisan some of these newly elected members are, that might be complicated. So, yes, please, sir.
Two questions. The many names that are being floated out there for running for president in 2 years, which of those names people have ranked higher? Number two, how far back in history do you have to go to find an approval of Congress?
I'm sorry, what?
50% of the vote. How far back in history do you have to go for population approval of Congress?
Oh, okay, two questions. One is, if we think about the many names that are being bandied about for president in 2020, which of them are relatively high in terms of legislative effectiveness? And the second point was going back, how far, if ever, do you have to go back to find approval for Congress that's above 50%? The second question I'll start with, off the top of my head, I don't know, because in my recent times, I'm willing to go back to the 1990s and even 80s. I don't believe we've ever had a time in which there's been approval of above 50% for Congress. I don't believe it happened during the Reagan years. In fact, I'm pretty confident it didn't. Congress took a huge hit in the early 1990s due to the government shutdown, which then led to Republicans losing control, or at least losing a lot of seats and Speaker Gingrich losing a speakership. In general, we have a long-standing pattern in the data in American politics that when asked on average, do you approve of Congress? On average, almost everyone says no, or not everyone, 80% to 90% say no. Then if you're asked, do you like your member of Congress? A very large portion of them say yes. The same political scientist I was referring to earlier, Richard Fenno, that's been coined as Fenno's paradox because he identified this very early in the 1960s and 1970s, that there is a substantial disconnect between the level of affection that we pass along to our own elected representative individually and the level of affection that we pass along to the chamber as a whole. And that's been pervasive across long swaths of American history. Coming back to your first question regarding the potential, or at least the measured effectiveness of some of the people whose names are being bandied about, some of these individuals are relatively newly elected, meaning they're in the 115th Congress, so we don't have data on them, like Kamala Harris, for example. Elizabeth Warren, she was the second most effective member of the Democratic Senate class that came in, and I believe, I'd have to take a look, but I believe she was also highly effective in the 114th Congress. Bernie Sanders has fluctuated a bit. There's been times he's been successful, but not entirely high flying. On the Republican side, John Kasich scores very low-ish consistently on our data. Part of that had to do with the fact, I suspect that, I mean, as many of you know, he's very much a budget hawk and cared quite a bit about budgetary politics. And under the Gingrich years, he was spending most, if not all, of his energy and political capital basically trying to facilitate budget cuts and balanced budget, and he just didn't really introduce much legislation. There's other names off the top of my head that I can't really recall at the moment, but if someone tosses out names, I could give you a gut reaction. As a quick piece of trivia, if we take a step back, when Mitt Romney was running for president in 2012 with Paul Ryan as his running mate, at that point we had all of the data, even though it hadn't been publicly released. Paul Ryan is by far one of the most ineffective members of the House across his entire career. Up until his last term of speakership, he finally got essentially above average. But he's consistently been relatively low. He's consistently low in comparison to the entire Republican caucus. We were being called by members of the media to weigh in on how successful he was as a lawmaker, and we decided at that point in the process, we didn't really want to engage with these types of issues. But some people who clearly portray themselves as being influential in advancing their agendas, they might be, but the data suggests otherwise. So the burden's really on them to explicate these points. Yes, please. Off the top of my head, I really can't recall, honestly, but it'd be up there. If you just click on Kentucky, it'll pop up really quickly. So, well, actually, let me just please. Mm-hmm. So the question is, can you elaborate on how compromise, or perhaps willingness to compromise, affects or contributes to effectiveness? Our research would suggest that individuals, at least in the House, we've engaged in less exploratory analysis in the Senate, but individuals who are consistently willing to reach across party lines, as well as potentially reach across chambers, actually proactively reach out to the Senate to find partners in the Senate. These are individuals who tend to be more successful at advancing their agendas than others. It's also the case, and this actually ties back to the female legislator finding, which we've obtained in the House and we've obtained in the Senate, and trust me, after you control for everything, it's still there. You cannot make this go away. That female members of the minority party tend to be more effective than female members of the majority, or pardon me, male members of the minority party. So this, of course, raises the question, why is that? I mean, a lot of open questions there. One thing we could point to in the data is that if you take a look at the different status steps we have in our score, that being bills being introduced, action in committee, action beyond committee. Action in committee and action beyond committee, those two steps necessarily involve people trying to reach out to form a coalition to try to get attention for your bill in committee, as well as trying to get it out of committee. It's clearly the case that at those stages, at least in the House, to a lesser degree in the Senate, but definitely in the House, women in the minority party are much more successful than men in the minority party at getting these things done, okay? Why is that? One quick point to note is, and this emerges very naturally in the data, is that women and men in the US House of Representatives do things differently depending on whether or not they're in the majority or minority party. On average, when men are in the majority party, they introduce lots of bills, they try to get things passed. Women also in the majority party try to introduce bills and get lots of things passed. There is not that much of a difference between the two of them. Women sometimes introduce a little bit more, but not markedly so. In the minority party, however, there's a huge switch. Women continue to essentially introduce lots of bills and try to get things passed. Men, once they move to the minority party, on average, stop introducing bills and perhaps engage in bomb throwing. Okay, this is pervasive in the data. You could identify many high-profile cases of female legislators who were in the majority party, who were unsuccessful at advancing their initiatives. They move to the minority party. They continue to introduce the exact same bill in the next Congress, and they're ultimately successful. Carolyn Maloney from New York is a perfect example of this. In contrast, men, once they move into the minority party, very often they dramatically curtail their legislative agenda. In some cases, they stop doing things. So much so that we could identify some of the highest performing male legislators in the majority party become some of the most ineffective legislators on our metric in the minority. So all is equal, there's a lot of psychological research that suggests that there tend to be differences in bargaining and negotiation styles in men and women in the laboratory setting as well as workplace environments. The extent to which this carries over into the US Congress, that'd be consistent with these findings. So I think we might have time for maybe 1.5-ish questions perhaps, yes.
Back to Tennessee.
Sure.
Will Lamar Alexander's score go up because of passing the Music Modernization Act, which is an earmark to Tennessee in a lot of ways?
Sure. Well, he'll have a score. I mean, I don't know how it's going to compare to other members of the U.S. Senate, though. Likewise, if we think about his involvement in the recent opioid legislation, I mean, essentially anything that his name is on as the primary sponsor, he's going to get credit for it as it evolves through the legislative process. Even if it ultimately doesn't get passed, he's still going to get credit for it receiving any sort of attention in committee or action beyond committee, et cetera. And we might have time for one more question, maybe. Anything else? Yes, please. Blackburn, so Congresswoman Blackburn in the most recent Congress, the 114th Congress, she scored basically at expectations. So she was essentially comparable to an average member of the U.S. House, given that she was the majority party and her status in terms of institutional position and her number of terms in the chamber. On average, there's been some Congresses that she's been below expectations. I believe there's been at least one Congress she's been above. She hasn't been consistently a dramatic underperformer, and she hasn't been consistently a dramatic overperformer. So, and with that, I believe we're up. So.